Welcome to the VDISummit on AI and Ethics. My name is Anita Prinzie. I am responsible for Product and Marketing Manager at Omina Technologies, sponsor of this webinar. Today we're going to talk about how to create trustworthy AI solutions. That's actually not that easy. It requires that you will translate legal requirements, legal guidelines, ethical principles, ethical guidelines into proper AI practices that eventually will result in trustworthy AI solutions. In order to get to AI practices that result in trustworthy AI solutions, there's a couple of risk controls that you can implement to reduce the inherent AI risks to residual risks that are perceived to be acceptable by society and your company. We have today 3 speakers. The first speaker is Martin Canter. He will give an overview of those different risk controls, being an ethics board, ethical checklist, and trustworthy AI by design. The second speaker, Dr. André Meyer-Vitali, is senior scientist at TNO, and he will dive a little bit deeper into trustworthy AI by design, and we'll talk about how hybrid AI can be leveraged to create solutions that are trustworthy by design. Next, our third speaker, Emmanuelle Shaaravi, who is a senior audit and controls professional, will actually talk about how you can validate whether those risk controls eventually result in AI solutions that are trustworthy. There are different validation tools you can use. You could implement an impact assessment, such as the data privacy impact assessment. You could do some auditing, independent auditing, obviously, and you could go for, let's say, a trustworthy AI certification. If after that validation your solution is deemed to be trustworthy enough, you can actually put it into production. And obviously you have to monitor your AI solution as it is in production, because risks of an AI solutions are dynamic, so you might have to go back to implement additional risk controls or adjust your controls. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Martin Canter, let's start off with some interactive question. So I would like to introduce you to a poll, and basically what I would like you to think about is whether you already have implemented some of the ethical risk controls I was talking about. So one of the ethical risk controls you could have implemented is ethical AI principles. So you could have stated that an AI solution has to be fair, for example, that your solutions have to be transparent. Second risk control you could have implemented is, for example, ethical AI guidelines or a code of ethics that try to translate those ethical principles and guide AI practitioners in implementing the ethical AI principles, so they design AI solutions that are more trustworthy. A third thing you could implement or could have implemented as an organization is an ethical AI checklist. That's even a more pragmatic way, provides more practical guidance to your AI experts, and it actually indicates that the AI practitioners have to implement certain technical checks or have to reflect on certain issues before they continue to the next step in the AI solution development. A fourth risk control you could have implemented is an ethics board or committee. It could be dedicated ethics AI board, or it could be your existing ethics board, including with some AI experts. It's also perfectly possible that you didn't implement yet any of the above risk controls. So if everything was fine, you might have seen this poll question popping up on your screen. Let's have a look at whether we have, how many of your companies actually did already invest in these kind of risk controls. We all are aware that AI solutions have different kinds of risk levels. That's why the European Commission makes a distinction between high risk and low risk AI solutions. Let's have a look at the results. So what we see is that actually the majority of the people that are present today actually did not yet implement any of the ethical risk controls. And that actually proves a little bit my understanding also of the market, that we are still learning how to cope with the different risks that AI solutions embody. If I look at the other results, I think about 21% actually implemented either ethical AI principles, code of AI ethics, or an ethical AI checklist. So Martin, our first speaker, who is head of ethical AI at Omina Technologies, will give you a little bit more explanation on those three different ethical risk controls. Then André Meyer-Vitali will talk about hybrid AI as a way to implement solutions that are trustworthy by design. And this will be followed by Emmanuelle, who will talk about different ways to validate whether the AI solutions are trustworthy. After that, we will have a Q&A session. You can actually already post your questions during this webinar in the Q&A box. With that, I give the floor to Martin.
Thanks a lot, Anita. Good morning, everyone. I do hope that you're able to hear me. So indeed, as Anita mentioned, I am Martin Canter. I'm head of ethical AI at Omina Technologies. And at Omina Technologies, we do believe that AI is for everyone, not just a happy few. And we've been putting AI in productions since 2016, really with a focus on explainable, transparent, and ethical artificial intelligence. So for this presentation, we'll be really focusing on an ethics board and how to actually use an ethics board to increase your ethical AI organizational capacity. Then we'll have a small look at ethical checklist and how to actually build them and where they come from, mainly from ethical principles. And then we'll have also a small use case as an example to really think about trustworthy AI by design and not post hoc. So this presentation will indeed be in three parts, and for the first part, I'll be focusing on building an ethical AI capacity using an ethics board. So ethical and trustworthy AI does pose a difficult challenge to organization. On the one hand, there is an increased sensitivity to ethical issues and a desire for responsible stewardship. On the other hand, outside the mere legal compliance, there is very little guidance for organizations about what being ethically responsible involves. So neither the public or the employee view just complying with the law as good enough for the moment, as we've seen with a lot of high-profile use cases recently. Legal guidance regarding AI and machine learning usually lags behind the technological innovations, and as a result, the ethical issues and questions that are confronted by organizations and practitioners usually arise prior to the development of an adequate legal regime. And usually even amongst organizations that do have adopted institutional value statements for data and ethics, there has been limited success in translating those statements into an organizational practices and decision-making process, and especially for the practitioners that actually do need to apply those statements. So in the end, we do hope that organizations that do develop capacity for ethical and trustworthy AI will be the one most trusted by the customers and the end users, and will be met with increased success. So to this extent, let's first look at how to build an ethical organizational capacity. So to achieve that, there are a couple of steps that we can actually follow. The first one is appointing ethics officers and groups. So those people are a little bit like data protection officers. You want to include ethics in their responsibility so that they will always be thinking outside their usual capacity, responsibilities, also about ethics and the impact of ethics on their day-to-day job. Second aspect is incorporating privacy and ethics-oriented risk and liability assessments into the decision-making process in your organization. Third point is also providing training, guidelines, and tools for your employees on responsible practices. You can also think about building incentives to encourage employees to identify potential problems and also solve them. A fourth point is also using a data certification system or an AI audit system that will assess data and AI use according to clear standards. And the last point, well, the one that really concerns us right here, is basically building an ethics committee for which we'll give a couple of responsibilities, a couple of tasks to achieve, and which can really help you incorporate all these other points and put them into practice. So we've seen in the past that committee-based oversight models have already been used effectively in different contexts. You can think, for example, about the medical context, for which protecting human research subjects, providing policy perspective, or even clinical guidance. And that type of committee oversight model does have a few features that's really that also makes them adapted for AI ethics. And if you look at committees, usually they have a couple of tasks that really comes to them. The first one is bring a couple of people together with a range of expertise. You want a broad committee, including technical, legal, ethical, and organizational aspects into the committee so that they can effectively analyze and assess and respond to complex problems. The second aspect is about providing a rapid response to the advances in technological capabilities. As we've seen that usually there is first a technical capability that arrives, and then only the law, if it needs to be applied, gets updated. So there, having a committee that can be proactive on that matter is really much more efficient. Thirdly, they can also develop standards, cases, and precedences, and also resources for your organization to be used in decision-making processes. And finally, they will also be able to constitute a governance body that can learn, adapt, and be a repository for your institutional knowledge. So that's the more they learn about it, the more they learn about your own organization and the problems that are that arise in your organization, the better that they can help your practitioners and your organization from within. There are a couple of steps that you can take to actually build an ethics committee, and I've listed them here. The first thing to think about is the organizational function of the committee. Why is the committee actually being created, and what's the purpose of the committee within the organization? Because without a clear conception of the intended institutional function of the committee and the responsibilities, it's actually quite difficult to implement a committee and for the committee to be able to have a clear task and to be efficient. A second aspect is the ethical content. You need to ask yourself the question about what are the basic values that the committee is meant to promote and protect. What are the rules and the standards and the goals that will guide the committee's work? And there you can think about the underlying values that we can also rephrase as ethical principle that we'll cover a bit later in this presentation. A third aspect is the committee composition. So I've already mentioned that, well, you need a broad range of expertise, but you can also think about including citizen participants and also non-institutional members to really have also an outsider perspective in your committee. I can also think about, well, you also need to make sure that there is no conflict of interest and that your committee's members are protected against bias and against conflicting interest between the committee, the ethics, and your organization, so that if there is a cost to the organization of raising objections from the committee member, you actually do protect the committee so that they can achieve their tasks quite well. The next action is the position and powers. Where is the committee situated within the organization, and what authority does the committee have? So you can think about either including the committee in a specific department or in multiple departments, or even creating a new unit for the committee so that it can stand outside the rest of your organization. And about the authority, you can think either on one hand of the spectrum about a consultative committee that anyone can go and consult, and they will mainly give advice about what can be done or what shouldn't be done, but it's mainly recommendations. On the other hand, you can also think about a committee that only a few people are allowed to go and see, and the committee needs to approve any action taken by the company, and they can basically block research or products if they think that ethical issues should first be addressed. Finally, you need also to think about who the committee needs to respond to and who is going to overview and oversee the committee's activities. Lastly, you need also to think about procedures and governance, mainly what is submitted to the committee for review and which process does the committee use for those reviews, and what are the standards by which the judgments are made and how are they issued. So there it's really also to help the rest of the organization to know exactly what to expect from the committee and how to interact with the committee. So now that we know how to build an ethical AI capacity, using a committee, we'll look at those principles and the checklist and how to efficiently use them and how to translate those principles and checklists into actions for practitioners. So when we think about checklists, we can think about a couple of checklists that already do exist, namely, for example, principles, namely the principles from the Association for Computing Machinery, which is basically a whole set of principles that kind of stand out already and that predates the rise of AI, or at least the last rise of AI as we know it. We've got also specific ethical principles applicable to AI. We can list the OECD AI principles, the Partnership on AI principle with their tenets, the Beijing AI principles, or last but not least, the one that we know in Europe, namely the European Union High-Level Expert Group, Ethical Guidelines for Trustworthy AI. There have been a couple studies that have covered global landscape on ethical guidelines, and usually, one of the last that I covered listed about 84 guidelines in total, and most of them actually have points covering transparency, justice and fairness, non-maleficence and responsibility, and so on. Now we can also have a closer look at the trustworthy guideline from the European Union, and we see that those points are actually taken also into account, and they contain a total of 7 really high-level principles, namely human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency. Then they go to diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, and also take into account the societal and environmental well-being and accountability. And so all those 7 focus together needs to be taken into account to build towards trustworthy AI. However, if you just look at them and a small description of those principles, it can be a little bit difficult to translate into practice. What we've also seen is that a lot of those good ideas principles have actually given rise to a lot of research on those topics, especially if you look at the academic history of fairness in machine learning. Well, it has, the interest for that has been rising quite a lot in the recent years. That has also led to the development of mathematical methods and software kits. And there we can list, for example, AIF 360, AIX 360 from IBM, maybe also the, I think, Equitas decision tree that helps you choose for a couple of fairness metrics, the LIFT, which is the LinkedIn Fairness Toolkit, or even the Scikit-Fairness from the well-known Scikit-Learn package in data science. The problem is that those methods and toolkits, they often rely on simplified and quantitative definitions of complex and nuanced concepts. And for instance, in the case of fairness, a lot of research have focused on primarily mitigating the performance disparities between the racial, gender, or age groups. However, in practice, it can be a bit more nuanced, it can be a bit more limiting or limited, and it's not always possible to apply those packages as they do exist. We've also seen that a lot of those packages actually have various qualities of code. Some of them are just implementation, quick implementation of academic codes, and they do make assumptions on data, which does not always make them usable in practice for your own organization, and that causes a gap between principles, available tools, and practitioners. So to go a little bit more into depth into those gaps between those principles and what practitioners actually need, is that we see that, well, first, differing assumptions or interpretations of those principles can lead to conflicting operationalizations of the principles. And these challenges can actually be masked when the principles are really left at a high level. Just think about, okay, we want societal well-being, whether we look at it in the US, in Europe, or in China, the interpretation of the society can be completely different. There is also a disconnection between the current focus of the ethics AI community and the needs of the practitioners, in particular for the operationalization, starting from the abstract nature of those principles to the development and deployment lifecycle of AI solution. Another point that we need to think about is that the ethical development and deployment of AI systems usually involves decisions that no individuals should be making on their own. The AI ethics principles can sometimes place those practitioners in a moral challenge by establishing the ethical responsibilities to the different stakeholders without offering any guidance on how to navigate those trade-offs. That changed alone. So this is also particularly true when you have conflicting expectations from the stakeholders. Let's say that, for example, you want to think about different stakeholders, that you as an AI practitioner are developing a solution for your company. Then you've got the business owners, the business users also, but the end customers, especially in the loan and the banking sector, where it can be a bit difficult to choose a correct trader for the practitioners. So as a result, and in spite of the best intentions, it is quite difficult to achieve the objectives of the ethics principles and their intended goal if they're not accompanied by other mechanisms to ensure that the good and the right ethical decisions are actually made. And since those principles are also not accompanied by concrete actions, well, sometimes it can actually happen that they're not accompanied by concrete actions, and that's actually called ethics washing. So companies will just lay out a couple of principles, say, okay, we want to think about this, but nothing is actually done behind it. And that ethics washing, a little bit like ecological washing, is sometimes also observed. And this has led to the emergence of checklists that will help practitioners, well, that are aimed at helping practitioners put those principles into actions. So the role of checklists is that they're used to make task completion, that they're used also to guide the decision-making process and to prompt critical conversations. You can, for example, think about in aviation, where checklists are usually serve as memory aids. In structural engineering, for example, when you're building very complex buildings, the checklist can also be used to ensure that stakeholders have met and discussed potential risks, and some of those risks might not always be known in advance. So there you can see the similarity between that and what happens in AI. So this might serve as an inspiration for the role of AI checklists in our situation, where the potential risk can also be diffuse and the concepts are often essentially contested, and it's not always possible to guarantee that the risk can be mitigated via a simple technical action. So I've listed here two different checklists that exist. The first one is DL, which means in Greek needful, right, proper. And the idea of that checklist is that it concatenates a whole other set of checklists into a tool that can be customized, so that you can create custom checklists for your own organization. Another one that does exist, and which is also quite extensive, is a checklist coming from the Johns Hopkins Center for Government Excellence, namely the Ethics Toolkits. And their assumption is that the use of algorithms is kind of inevitable, that all data has bias, that all algorithms have bias, and that people also have bias. Providing practitioners with the right tools or ideas or questions to be able to question everything and to make educated and insightful ethical choices. The last checklist that we can also think about, especially in the context of the European Union, is the ALTAI. So it's not yet completely a checklist in the sense that initially it was called an assessment list for trustworthy AI, and the idea was to use that assessment once a use case was finished, once a solution was deployed, to be able to assess it post hoc. The idea behind it was just to translate the ethical principles into a list. It was really grounded into the protection of the people's fundamental rights, which is really important in Europe. And it was indeed intended to help organizations identify AI risks, identify the active measures that are required or that were implemented, and to encourage a thoughtful reflection or to promote basically those conversations, those actions that are required to build towards trustworthy AI. We see nowadays, however, that a lot of the feedback provided by the companies that started using the ALTAI is actually not to use it only at the end, but rather earlier in the development process and the implementation process. And so it can serve also more as a checklist to make sure that you do not forget about a couple of points. Studies have also shown that there are a couple of good practices that you can put in place to use checklists correctly so that you can maximize their efficiency. For instance, the first stuff to do is that since AI efforts are usually the result of ad hoc processes driven by passionate individuals, some problems can occur when the organizational structure and culture basically inhibits the efficacy of those efforts. So their checklist can actually provide an organizational infrastructure to formalize the processes and empower individuals. But it usually only works if the teams are aligned with, if the checklists are aligned with the team's existing workflows, and if it's also supported by a change in your organizational culture. Second aspect is that, well, The checklist can also sometimes be too general and too long to be applicable to specific circumstances. So there, aligning the checklist to the roles and the existing workflow can also improve the effectiveness. You can think, for example, about project managers or product owners that will take a checklist initially and already filter out all the questions that are applicable. Let's say that you're building something to make predictions on machines, predictive maintenance. You can probably already remove a lot of data privacy and people's fundamental right to begin with, because it's probably not going to be applicable in those specific use cases. Next point is that you need also to take into account the conflicts that can occur at an organizational level between the desire to consider AI ethics and the business imperatives. For instance, you can ask yourself the question at one point in time: do I do the good thing, or do I do the thing that will help me ship the product? And there, it raises the question of the social cost for individuals who raise a concern about AI fairness and who are then perceived as impeding the pace of work. So they are protecting those people when they actually raise a red flag and push the red button can also help them. And having the support of a checklist and just saying, okay, it's in the checklist, I checked it, and we have a problem, really helps them quite a lot. Next point is about that fairness issues are usually identified by practitioners when they see and they spot an issue. So then those issues are then discussed and solved locally. And if you actually use a checklist, it will also entail the creation of post points to check for issues. And this can also help reduce anxiety of potentially missing mistakes. So there, the support of a checklist will really create and prompt those conversations and not only be used as, okay, we've seen something that goes wrong, we need to think about it. And last, you also need to avoid techno-solutionism. So there, just having a simple checklist that is used to say, okay, we check the box, or we have a specific fairness criteria are crucial to meet is not sufficient. You should rather use a checklist by saying, okay, we need to define a specific fairness criteria and prompt the conversation within your organization so that people think about it instead of giving them a specific technical target to meet. All right. Then the last point that I wanted to discuss is actually, well, think about trustworthy AI by design. So ethics by design. So now that's, well, I hope that you've got that building an ethical organizational capacity quite important. The translation between principles to checklist and to the problems that can be encountered in practice is also quite important. And if you want to go one step ahead, it's really thinking about once you design your solution, how to make it ethical to begin with. A use case that I will present here is something that we've done at Omina Technologies. So we had a recommendation engine that we had to build for one of our clients. And the idea for them was that they have a product which provides workplace training and educational content for employees of specific companies. So the companies are the clients and the employees of that companies are the end users. And the idea for them was to reduce the cost of training employees to provide them content. And that product would then recommend staff with video channels from YouTube or specific videos from YouTube, news sites and articles, also content from Good Habits, which is another company, are providing specific way of life content, and sometimes also the company's specific channel, let's say a documentation on new products or new tendencies on the market. The problem, if you're a bit familiar with recommendation system, is that usually they require quite extensive information about the users, and they usually work either through content filtering or collaborative filtering or combination of both, by comparing also users' similarities on a granular level. So there, if you actually had built a solution using and leveraging that information, collecting a lot of information about the users, and then only thinking about it post-hoc, it wouldn't have really worked. If you actually look at the Altai, there is one specific question that's really relevant here about privacy, is that did you consider the impact of AI system on the right to privacy, the right to physical, mental, and moral integrity, and the right to data protection? Trying to answer that question post-hoc would have been a little bit too late. And there we actually thought about privacy by design and decided instead of using user-specific information, we would rather try to map all the users by asking them a couple of questions to a specific persona based on a psychological mapping, and also map them towards their specific company and a specific country. And that would actually give us a representation in terms of percentages to different groups for each and every user. So each and every user would then be personally, well, have a different distribution, but still from that distribution, nobody would have been able to actually reconstruct the initial user. So that kind of information really protects the initial user from identification. Second step that you also thought about to begin with is really that, well, I think that a lot of people are aware of that problematic in recommendation engine, is that the more you recommend stuff which is similar to what you've already seen before, the more you actually get stuck into some kind of bubble. So there we also thought about including specifically a random component to make sure that people would still be exposed to complete random content and still keep their options open. We also thought, well, about the rest basically of those principles and applicable that would have been applicable to this use case. And one of the most important one that we thought was really useful here was first the transparency. So we've directly exposed and explained to the end users how the system actually works, so that they know once they subscribe to the system how it works and how their data is or isn't actually here used. And we've also involved those stakeholders along all the steps of the development process, so that everyone was actually on board and could weigh in into the conversation about making the correct technical choices. So thanks a lot for your attention. I hope that it was interesting for you. And yeah, there are just a slide to speak a bit about our product Justify, which is basically the platform and the product that we're developing at Omina Technologies, which basically aims at empowering business users to deliver AI solution in an ethical and explainable way. And all the points that I've mentioned before, we actually try to put all those tools into actions for the practitioners that will need to be able to use them, so that you can also design your own AI constraints from an ethical and explainable way and get those constraints into the solutions that Justify provides you with.
And how to leverage it to create trustworthy AI solutions.
Okay, good morning. This is André Meyer-Vitali. Hope you can hear me all well, so I'll take over from here. So in the second part of this presentation, I want to go a bit deeper into talking about what trustworthiness is, what definition of, well, kind of definition of trust, and also go a little bit deeper into the issue of causality, cause and effect, then explain why we need hybrid AI and what it is, basically, and from there on, show you some ideas and results we have produced in, recently in what I would call AI engineering. So in how to create trustworthy AI systems. Oops, I'm pressing too quickly. So yeah. What is trust? Trust is something that is rather a complex phenomenon, and it is something that is not just something that you just create and then you have it. Trust is something that has different aspects. I list a few here, and also trust emerges over time. So the aspect of experience is very important. That if you interact with a system, that after a while you will get accustomed to it, and your expectations will become such that you can actually experience trustworthiness, and that is particularly important for high-risk applications, as will be mentioned later on. Now, if you look at trustworthy AI systems, I list a few aspects here that are of importance to create trust. So the first one would be fairness. Fairness means fair distribution of resources and outcomes of, for example, predictions or classifications, all these kind of things. And what is often associated with fairness is the idea of bias. Bias has been a problem in many cases, like with gender, for example. And I would argue that bias is not necessarily only to be seen as a negative thing. So a lot of literature also deals with just removing bias. But I think that is the wrong approach, because what we need is what I would call bias awareness. That means we need to be aware that there is bias. And actually bias is something that we create voluntarily in order to have a certain opinion, and is actually also the basis of our culture. So bias can be different in different cultures. There's an interesting article referring to that as well that I list at the bottom right by Virginia Dignam. Then the second aspect is robustness. Of course, you want to have trustworthy systems to produce reproducible, reliable results, to be predictable, but also to be able to cope with errors, something that's often referred to as graceful degradation. When something goes wrong, that not everything fails at once, but that you can step back and keep going on. Then a very important aspect is transparency. So we want to have these systems to be interpretable, understandable. It's often called also explainable. We want to explain why certain results come out, and that can be done either ex ante. That means it is built in to the system from the start. So that's also complies with the idea that Martin mentioned with the trust by design. But it can also be done ex post. That means we have a system that we didn't design as a trustworthy system, but we still can explain certain aspects of why outcomes are produced. And then, of course, accountability is very important. We'll come back to that later. Verification is another aspect. And then accuracy, of course, we still want, with all these other aspects, we still want to be the system to produce accurate, correct results. So the quality must be maintained. In order to evaluate the trustworthiness of an AI system, we need to be able to kind of measure how all these aspects, how good they are, how well they are implemented in that system. And there is an idea that we worked on recently, that's work in progress, something that we call key trustworthy indicators. These are metrics to measure those different aspects. So it's related to what is well known as the KPIs, the key performance indicators, but then specifically targeted towards the aspects of trust. And what is also important to note is the issue of trust calibration, because trust can also be either too much or too little. So if you have too little trust, it's referred to as under-reliance in a system, then you would just not use that system. Because, yeah, if you don't trust it, especially for critical tasks, you would just not use it. But there is also the other issue of over-reliance, where you trust the system too much, you have too high expectations, and then you will have irrational beliefs of what it can do. And that can also lead to fear. So you would also not use such a system because you fear that it's too powerful. And both are, of course, not desirable. So both the fear and lack of trust are a problem. And so we're trying, also in the context of upcoming EU regulation, to provide a European way of dealing with mitigation of risks to avoid these issues. Then trust is also, of course, an issue of just efficiency, both in computational efficiency, but also efficiency with data. The more efficient your system is, the more trustworthy it can also be, and the more transparent and explainable. And of course, we also have to take into account the whole social context, the interaction with the users, socio-technical norms and expectations, and a multiplicity of points of view, and which I will refer to later on in the context also of multi-agent systems, and yeah, the whole area of implementing ethics and law for reliable and systems will be dealt with later on also by Emmanuelle. Now, a very interesting issue is dealing with how current AI systems work, especially machine learning systems that produce find patterns in huge amounts of data. These patterns are basically based on correlation. So in this example here, we found a high correlation in time between sales of ice cream and sunburns. So such a system would then predict that, well, the more ice cream you sell, the more sunburns you get. So in order to reduce sunburns, he would have to reduce the selling ice cream. Well, it doesn't really work that way, of course, because correlation cannot distinguish between these two parts. So what we have instead is what is called causation, and we can, well, in this example at least, we can very easily understand that these both effects are caused by a lot of sun. So yeah, this very clearly explains that there is a big difference between correlation and causation. You can also see this again in this is another representation of the same example. So the correlation is just between two different effects, which we cannot say that one causes the other or the other way around, but actually neither is the case. And then we have causation, where there's actually a cause and an effect relation between sunny days and both ice cream sales and sunburn rates. Well, if we go into this a little bit deeper, as we just saw, correlation does not imply causation, but yeah, that's exactly how machine learning works. So we have only statistical relations between effect X and Y, but we don't know which direction, and we don't know whether one causes the other or not at all. But if we look at causal relations, there are different types of relations. So either X causes Y, Y causes X, or there is actually, and that is like the case with the sun, there is a third, the cause, which is also called the confounder, that causes the other two. And these things are represented in these causal diagrams, and you can see here. There's another example at the top here, which shows causal relations between vaccination, a reaction, and, well, in this case it was smallpox, but you can imagine other diseases that are more up to date, and they all can lead to death, but of course with different probabilities. So having such a diagram showing these relationships helps a lot to understand yeah, what are the causes for certain effects that we can measure. Maybe I will skip the rest of this. I think you got the point that we really need to think further than just correlations. So if we look at this idea of hybrid AI, well, what is it? Where does it come from? As I mentioned before, machine learning is an important part of AI, but it is not everything. Artificial intelligence exists for more than 50 years at least, and there have been many different waves, different approaches, and yeah, only in the last decade, machine learning has been very dominant. But what we see is that these systems are, although they can do a lot of good things, they also have their problems. So I reduced it here to 3 problems. So yeah, current AI, especially machine learning systems, are brittle. That means that very small variations in the data can lead to very different outcomes. So it is very very risky. They're also very narrow in the sense that they can only deal with very specific tasks. And they're opaque in the sense that we don't know how they figure out a certain result, a certain prediction. And these are all 3 very tricky things to deal with. So the idea is that is coming up more and more is to use hybrid AI, namely the combination of different types of approaches to AI to overcome those problems. This is also referred to as some people call Symbolic AI. Some people also call it the third wave. There's a paper of Luis Lamp and Garces about this. And the idea is that actually also human intelligence is based on not just the learning aspect, but also building up knowledge, communication, reasoning with the knowledge. So this is very much in line also with how we work. And the hybrid AI approach towards AI increases trustworthiness by improving on the mutual strengths of those different approaches by combining them. Some references also from other literature that motivate this approach are, for example, the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, who refers to the different types of thinking of humans, certain intuition combined with reasoning and knowledge. Daniel Dennett also refers to this in a bit of a different time scale as well. He sees a difference between short-term learning, which he would call knowledge acquisition. That is what humans do when learning. But there's also a very long-term adaptation, which is called evolution. And that means that also the genetic code is changed. And then, of course, there's also the idea of social intelligence, the theory of mind, the thinking about what others think, and reflection about how we interact, expectations of others, etc. So if we take all of this into account, then we can build much more reliable, transparent, and fair systems. So again, hybrid AI is both what is called also the neurosymbolic AI, this combination of reasoning, learning, and sharing of knowledge. If you have all of those 3, then you could talk about hybrid AI. Another aspect is also the human-in-the-loop aspect, so the interaction with the user. This is also sort of hybrid AI. So these are sometimes a bit confused, but well, in the end, they're all very relevant. So what can we do? We can use, for example, knowledge to improve learning, something that's called informed machine learning. We can also use learning to improve knowledge. So to update, for example, our ontologies, our knowledge models. And we can share knowledge to learn from each other. Something that's also known as federated learning or multi-agent learning, where we can also that not every system has to start from scratch learning what is already known, but you can get information and knowledge from others. And especially this notion of you don't need to learn what you already know is a very important aspect of hybrid AI. If we now look at engineering aspects of how to build such systems, then we can also see that this idea of combining all these various approaches. Of course, there are so many ways in which you can do that. A few years ago, we came up with the idea of a methodology called boxology that tries to capture different combinations in design patterns, so that we can orchestrate, build such systems. You can see a reference to the relevant papers there. We started off with a taxonomy to explain how to come up with a common language that we actually can talk to each other in these different strands of AI that hitherto were really diverse. We have defined 4 main concepts: instances, models, processing, and actors. And then with many more sub-categories than you can see here. Let's just give an overview. And then we defined a way to represent them in diagrams. So we have here these 4 main concepts again with different shapes. We defined a whole library of patterns, very simple ones like this one, where you have an instance that is processed to produce a model. A very typical case of machine learning. You can combine them, so you have compositional patterns. And again, here, this is the top left is the typical case of how you have a bunch of data, you train, use this data to train a certain model. On the bottom left, you have the second part of a machine learning system, which is actually not the learning part, but the execution part, where you have the same model, you use different data, and you can do deduction to produce a certain symbol, which would be a prediction or a classification typically. And then you can do exactly the same thing, but you start off from a symbolic approach. And this shows that these approaches are actually not that different, so they can be combined if we find the right ways to connect them. And if you well, I'll skip that for time. That should be clear by now. An example of how this can be used is this one, combination of 2 different patterns, where we have first a semantic model describing relationships of objects in the real world, like, for example, a chair is composed of a cushion and an armrest and other things. And we have a machine learning system that tries to recognize objects with computer vision in such a picture. Now, this for the purely machine learning dependent data-driven approach, it's very difficult to figure out whether this rose here is actually a rose or whether this thing is a cushion. But if we integrate the symbolic knowledge, that the probability that this would be an actual flower is much, much lower than that it would be a cushion, then we can increase the probability and the reliability of this system, and in that sense also increase the level of trust. So in that sense, hybrid AI can, by design, lead to much more trustworthy systems. Yeah, I have more examples. I think I'm running a bit out of time. I want to also mention the idea that there's also a very important aspect called agency, which is the basis of distributed AI. We have systems that are not just monolithic, but you have different components, and that's becoming more and more important also in network systems, in Internet of Things approaches, edge computing, such as in 5G, edge AI, where you have different parts that are autonomous and they coordinate their actions. And in that sense, it's also important to notice that doing this, looking at systems as a combination of autonomous entities, and defining specific roles and delegations and limited scope of what these components can do will also lead to increased trustworthiness, because you can have clearer accountability of who is doing what, who is allowed to do what, and you get more insight into what is happening in such a system. As an example, I think I will just show you this one. This is also based on this boxology methodology, where we have these triangles for actors, and in this case, this is an Industry 4.0 use case where you have different actors doing their tasks within a factory and organizing themselves with negotiating amongst each other, who is doing what at what time, etc. I'm not going into all the details here. Yeah, a few words about what are the plans with this methodology. So we want to develop this further from a means of producing diagrams for explaining systems or for visualizing them to actually build systems. And yeah, so there are different ways you can do that. And in the end, what we want to achieve is basically a framework for auditing systems. So you can, on the one side, create trustworthy systems by design. So if you build a new system, you can be sure that it complies with all these aspects that we've mentioned before, hopefully measurable as well. But also to audit existing systems that have not been built using this methodology. But of course, there's still a lot of systems out there that are used, and we still want to know whether they are trustworthy or not. Yeah, so there's a few takeaway messages from what I was trying to convey. Yeah, so the definition of trust as a combination of different aspects and experience, that AI is more than just machine learning, the role that hybrid AI can play, and of agency, and yeah, the methodology that was showing. So yeah, I hope we can discuss this in more detail later on. Thank you.
Thank you, André. So with that, I give the floor immediately to Emmanuelle. She will talk about how to validate whether your risk controls, being an ethical board or ethical checklist or trustworthy AI by design, for example, leveraged by hybrid AI, whether that actually results in trustworthy AI solutions. Emmanuelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So for me, the first question I would ask is, what are the AI risks? And the most suggested one by the community today in AI is that the AI risks are privacy, ethics, trust, bias, and cybersecurity. And the second question that I would ask is how to handle them by having a reliable and efficient internal controls framework, including an impact assessment with the continuous monitoring, and with transparency, of course, by disclosing key information. And that's the key factors for a successful implementation of a trustworthy AI tool. And of course, we all know that it's a cost to implement a strong and robust internal controls framework within a company, but the organization need to see it as an investment. And not so long ago, following the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, there was a think tank who published a study explaining that this law will drive some huge compliance costs for the companies and that it will hurt innovation within the European Union. And if we look further, this think tank was supported mainly by companies like Amazon, Apple, or Microsoft, just to name a few of them. And again, some analysts within the EU Commission are questioning the data, but even without questioning the study as itself, we can just look at it, and it's really similar to what happened in the past with the tobacco industries, with the health studies, or in the oil and gas industry with the sustainable studies. But I would say that with social media today, it's not the same game or gambling as previously. So the companies cannot approach such situation in the same way. There is one thing that the organization do not wish. It's kind of being named and shamed by the users on the social media. And of course, any organization wish to comply with the law, but it's also important for them to measure the reputational risk, and that could bring this reputational image could bring the organization to proactively ensure that their AI environment is under control. So the organization wished to have an internal control framework, efficient and operational, obviously working on a day-to-day basis, not cumbersome, having a reliable reporting with some compliance objectives, which can be, of course, legal objective, but not only ESG, ethics, or sustainable development goals. And we have to have in mind that the organization do not only want to measure legal risk or financial risk, they also want to measure the reputational damage that could pop up or result from a decision taken. And there are 3 pillars to achieve it: the performance and the profitability, including the safeguarding of assets, which is going through data protection today. And they can have a kind of a return on investment analysis by seducing new users or approaching different users by delivering a strong data protection policy, making them comfortable on how their data are collected, deleted, and limited to strictly to the consent they provided for. And that's kind of, I would say, promotion and communication tool. The second pillar is the completeness and accuracy. So, of course, the organization wants to have the best tool ever and working properly, but they need first to define what is complete and what is accurate. Sometimes 100% accuracy, or it may be even very often, cannot be attainable. And therefore, if proper accuracy can be reachable for a certain category of people, the organization needs to question this lack of accessibility to minorities. We can think about the facial recognition tools where it's working much better for white men faces rather than for colored female faces. So that's clearly a subsequent but clearly a discriminatory measure which is in breach with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Therefore, there is a need to be completely transparent from the start on the company side, and even questioning the launch of such tool with such a bias issue. And finally, as a last pillar, the company wish, of course, to be compliant with the local regulation. So how do you create trust within society and therefore design at the same time a reliable and efficient process for the internal control framework? So you want to have a strong documentation process, which is part of your risk management system. And you will start with the necessity assessment and the proportionality study, which is part of the impact assessment. And the organization will call for a consultation process, which makes me think of a kind of a GET process, where it could be extended to external advice or external experts. And then you have the impact assessment. And let's be crystal clear, this needs to start before collecting any data, or even will have to be reevaluated all along the product life cycle. And you can read it as conformity assessment or post-market monitoring in the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. This is kind of impact assessment. And the development phases and testing phases, so prior to any deployment of the tool, but also post-deployment of the tool, you will have such evaluation approach as reliability and validity testing, which will help you to ensure that does the does the algorithm do what it says it does, and that it measures what it's expected to be measured. And explainability tools are supposed to support the organization in, especially for black box models, which are very complex, I would say that's an evaluation approach which is supposed to support the organization in providing interpretable and explainable outputs. So I will focus on the impact assessment, but those evaluation approaches are key to mention because they are part of the impact assessment and they are part of the duties of each business process owner. So we have a poll question, and which is of the following impact assessment have you done in the past? And then you have the possibility of having done a data privacy impact assessment, a human rights impact assessment, an assessment list for Trustworthy AI, or a self-assessment for Singapore's model AI governance framework, or none of them. So just I will just repeat this question. So which of the following impact assessment have you done in the past in your company, if it's the case? If you have done any, is it a DPAI? Is it a human rights impact assessment? Or an assessment list for Trustworthy AI? Or is it a self-assessment for Singapore's model AI governance framework? Okay, and the results. It seems that many of you have done the DPAI, so that's good. So I will continue with the presentation. Oops. So yes, so just to come back with the necessity assessment, because that's where you will start your impact assessment by defining the legal basis for data processing, and you will define the scope, context, nature, and context and purpose of your data processing. How did you collect the data? Where does it come from? How many data subjects it concerns? The geographical area? All of these questions are very important from the start. And you will also ask yourself if there is any other way, other methodology to achieve the purpose you want to achieve with the tool. And from the start, thinking about implementing a data minimization policy is key, because you will question what data should I store, where should I store those data, should I delete those data, or even at which point of time should I delete those data. And in a nutshell, you're creating a virtuous ecosystem of internal policies. And by clearly defining the purpose of your tool at that point of time from the start, you're sharing any potential drift monitoring with the relevant team. And that allows you to question yourself, does the algorithm still do what it says it does? It's important because you can collect one consent for one specific purpose, and you cannot use this consent from data subject for another purpose. So that's very important for you. We can think about this Microsoft 365 tool, which was used to track employee productivity by allocating a productivity score. And originally, this was not supposed to be used for that. So, of course, Microsoft is responsible for that because he created this tool, but the organization using it and collecting data from the employees by using such a use of tool, such a data from the employee for calculating or for allocating a productivity score is also the responsibility of the organization who is using this tool by not collecting, in that case, let's say, the consent from the employees. So then the organization needs to perform a proportionality study by weighing up the legitimate interest of deploying and of developing such tool versus the data subject's rights and freedom, meaning that it should not be harmful to the data subject, obviously not detrimental to them. And to assess the risk having a strong internal control framework will support the organization in doing it. So first, the organization will assess the risk, and with the criticality, low, medium, high risk, let's say, and the likelihood of such risk, of course, and if a risk mitigation is needed. So if there is a need for a risk mitigation, then a control needs to be put in place, and the frequency of control also at that point of time needs to be defined. It's a risk-based approach, and it's industry field dependent. In case a risk mitigation is needed and a mitigated control is implemented, and if the risk cannot be removed entirely, then there is a residual risk. And it's important to measure this residual risk. The organization will think about putting a threshold for such a residual risk up to a point they are not going to accept it. And we have to think it's not only legal risk, it's not only financial risk, it's also reputational risk. So how do you concretely, I would say, assess those risks and document about it, which is a very important step. So a top-down risk-based approach is what is currently applied to financial statements. And in today's environment, business processes rely more and more on the data collection and therefore on the artificial intelligence tools. And as a consequence, controls need to be tackled by layer. You have your mega process, you have sub-process, it can be processors, even joint controller relationships. You have embedded tools with multi-agent reinforcement learning systems, as mentioned André previously, with this combination of autonomous entities. So that's why it's top-down. And the first step to do this approach is to assess the current situation within the company. So the existence of existing control and their effectiveness, obviously. The second step is the definition of the scope of work and the related processes based on the risk materiality. What is the level of control I intend to implement? Do I plan or already have resources allocated to it? It can be human resources or financial resources. And that assessment is not only a one-shot study. It has to be reevaluated regularly because there is some change either within the organization or externally. It can be regulatory change, can be new cyber security challenge will pop up, or also key employee moving in and moving out. And therefore, this leads us to the third step, which is the documentation and the evaluation. A strong documentation is very important about the related processes, and that will include the business owners, business process owners, which are entitled to, and the control owners with process narratives, data flow diagrams, where you have each data entry point identified, and also the risk entry point, where you could have potential security breach or potential data poisoning threats. So that's a very important documentation. And it's not only internal documentation, it can be also external policies. That's important for transparency towards the data subjects, the users, or towards the employees, or towards your third parties you're working with. It's an evidence also of training to the relevant stakeholders within the organization. So, of course, deficiencies will be identified during such analysis and such assessment, and certainly investigation will be opened and conducted. And this leads us to our 4 steps, because those deficiencies will need to be reported to the highest management. And step 5 and 6 can be addressed together as remediation plan, because a remediation plan for those deficiencies will be proposed to the highest management, and action plan will need to take place for each deficiency. But as a general guideline, all of the above that we've discussed cannot happen without a very clear and robust corporate governance, endorsing ownership and accountability. We need a business process owner for each data processing, and we need to ensure that this business process owner is reporting to the highest management. And there is inevitably at this stage a necessity to have this kind of consultation or GET process to perform the assessment. So if you think about a GET process, you will go with the presentation of your case to the management team. And this management team generally is very well represented by all departments within the company, which can be IT department, finance, marketing, trade department, or also data science. And depending on your industry, you can have many departments represented. But you also need to have the audit and controls team, compliance and legal teams to be part of it, and of course the ethics committee, which was mentioned by Martin earlier in the presentation. And it is a really formalized process. It's not a standard meeting. You really go to the gate 1 for an approval of your presentation of the project. Gate 2 will be with evolvements and the business case presentation, and until the gate approval for the launch of the tool. And you can also think about a post-gate approval, where you will have return on investment analysis provided, impacts that happened post-deployment also analysis. That needs to take place. So the organization also wish to have external advice in that case. Why? Because let's imagine your company is launching or is wish to develop emotional toys. They may aim to have parents and children within the feedback process. Or if you have a bias issues towards minorities, you may aim to have a strong diversity within your team for your GET approval process. So that's the point of having a very strong and robust corporate governance structure within your company. And so finally, what about the independent audit and the certification? And similar to accounting standards used by audit firms, I would say personal accountability should be enhanced in artificial intelligence. And having certification will strengthen, will reinforce this control environment. External audit with a certification is an evidence of transparency towards the regulator, towards the shareholders, towards the users, towards the third parties, but even towards the employees. And it's also a way, this independent audit, to avoid any potential conflict of interest that you may have with internal control departments, because the internal control department may experience some pressure from the top. It could happen, and that's why this corporate governance structure that we discussed, with ownership and accountability defined, that has to be part of the company culture. It has to be endorsed by the board, and it has to come from the top management. I am a fellow in a volunteer, in a non-profit organization named For Humanity, and I'm just sharing their website because they are very interesting, as they are open to everyone as a citizen, and it's very diverse because present in numerous countries, and that's what makes them interesting. Also, it's open source, so anyone can benefit from what they are discussing, and they are developing certification. But it's not only to be GDPR compliant. It's a bit more than that, in my opinion, because they are developing a certification ensuring that the tools are not harmful towards humans. And I would say that this is very important, in my opinion, to have such certification today, because it's more and more important, as we have seen with the reputational impact that can have AI today on the society. To avoid, I would say it's important to avoid this ethics washing. It's what we can see, we have seen in the past with the greenwashing. And this is not only to have a certification with that non-profit organization. It's more than that. It's doing good. So that's why I invite you. Everyone is welcome. You don't need any specific skills or whatever. You just need to be citizen. And the last slide will summarize just what we just went through. And I will reinforce the message that having a reliable and efficient internal controls framework is key in artificial intelligence too, because it will help the organization to detect legal, financial, and reputational risk through a top-down and risk-based approach. And this is very important, and this can only happen if you have a strong and robust corporate governance structure within your company. And of course, independent audit and certification will reinforce the artificial intelligence environment and its transparency. So thank you, everyone.
And all speakers. So now is the time that we're going to look into some interesting questions that we received from the audience. Maybe I would like to start with a question for André. So one of the questions we had is the following. Where did you line in basic trust of users towards AI? So where is the user trust? Where do you model it? Where do you handle that kind of stuff? I think we are referring probably to end users here.
Yes, that's already part of the answer. Who are the users? Because all these aspects of trust that I mentioned, of course, are not global. So if you look at, for example, explainability, explainability can mean different things for different users. As an example, in a medical case, the explanation that a patient receives and that a doctor receives would be different. So there is not one way of explaining everything sufficiently to everybody. And the same, for example, also with transparency. When is transparency transparent enough? You don't want to know everything about every system. So also there it depends on who you explain something to.
Yeah, I think that is a perfect answer, and it relates to another question that we received. It's a question I think Martin could easily answer. So the question is, can you elaborate a little bit on the definitions of and the relationship between trustworthy AI and ethical AI on the other hand? So you referred, André, to explainable AI and transparency. So what is the relationship between ethical AI, explainable AI, and trustworthy AI?
That's an interesting question. To me, it's rather different concepts that are similar to each other. And that need to be taken into account on different levels. Namely, ethical AI, to me, well, my understanding is really, okay, what are the moral questions that you can ask yourself and how to answer them to do what is right or what should be right from a moral perspective. If you also take into account the explainable parts and all that together, then you're basically building towards building trust with your user and customers, or even the rest of society. To me, trustworthy AI is not only about the user that are going to be using an AI solution, but also outsiders, which will be looking at something that works, that does not directly affect them, and to see if they can actually trust the system or not. And that's where all those different notions about explanations, about the correct moral choice, about the impact of that solution on the rest of society actually are taken into account into the trustworthy AI compass umbrella, basically.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually also a perfect link to the next question we received. And it's a question about, is it only about compliance to rules, or also responsibility of a company as part of the society in its entirety, and how? So I don't know, perhaps Emmanuelle, you can chime in here.
Yes, it's true. It's not only a regulatory compliance, and we have seen you can also have reputational damage that can pop up. So that could convince the company to act better towards the society, I would say. So of course, it's a responsibility of the builder of the tool, but it's also, as we mentioned, the responsibility of the controller of an organization that is using one specific tool. I would say, if we think about HR tools that are discriminating because I don't know, the algorithm behind is calculating differently from one person to another with the same speech. And with the SWAN qualification, so then we can really think that it's a responsibility of the company first of using that tool to perform an action. So for me, how to avoid or how to convince a company, it's of course by telling them that they have today a reputational risk by using, and they can also hurt themselves. If we continue on the same example of this HR tool, we can think that they are impacting, unfortunately, by discriminating a category of person. Maybe they are missing the key person to hire, I would say, or things like that. And how to avoid it? It's also by having this independent audit, also having this internal control within the company, of course, but having this independent audit and certification, which is key because it helps also the company to detect some risk and some impact, negative impact that they would not have foreseen.
Mm-hmm. And I think it relates a little bit to corporate social responsibility as well. So one of the principles of the ALTAI is actually improving the impact for the society as a whole, environmental impact, but also for the society. And maybe to conclude the Q&A, I have a question that each of you could answer. It's a little bit related to whether AI is something that will always be limited to the thinking of a single programmer. So the persons who are actually implementing and writing the code of the AI solution. And is it therefore not able to think holistic, for instance? So I think that's a question that relates to each of the three talks that we have seen today. Who would like to go first?
Okay, maybe I can try to give a small answer to that. I think that's relating then to the specific problem, and as a practitioner myself, I am indeed limited to my way of thinking about the specific problem. But that's why it is important to actually involve stakeholders and different types of profiles together to provide the good answers. And it's not only a question of a technical solution, but also looking at the right questions and providing the right answer from different perspectives to be able to implement them afterwards. So I think that there, having good enough representation of society will allow to have a better, a more holistic approach towards artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
André
or Emmanuelle, do you want to chime in?
Yes, please. Shall I? Yeah. Of course, it's not only the responsibility of one programmer. You all have to look at the whole system, from the users to developers to also the organizational aspects. It's all involved. And actually, I would like to also, in the context, also answer another question that was in the chat about AI that we are not aware of. And exactly there, I think there are extremely big risks. If we compare, for example, systems like recommender systems that we all know that there's some form of AI behind, but it's very low risk, because if you get a wrong advertisement, a wrong suggestion for reading a book that you're not interested in, well, so what? But especially when you're not aware of it, and I think of, for example, use cases in public service or in banking, financial world, where critical systems are being replaced or supported by AI, and even the public servants or people working in a bank are not really aware of what is going on there, but the clients or the citizens have no clue at all how they are evaluated or treated. And yeah, in that sense, it's really important to take the whole context into account.
Mm. Yeah, and I think for me, AI in the future should really be a multi-stakeholder process. So I think it aligns also a little bit with what Emmanuelle was saying, that you need a kind of gate process between different stakeholders, and not only internally but also externally. Okay. Unfortunately, we have to conclude this question and answer session. I would like to thank, obviously, all the participants of today. I hope you really learned a thing or two about trustworthy AI solutions, how hybrid AI can help you to create trustworthy AI by design, what the function could be of an ethics board, ethical checklist, that kind of stuff. And obviously, it has a strong link with risk management. How can you control your AI risks? So with that, I would like to also thank our speakers of today. Martin Canter, Head of Ethical AI at Omina Technologies, André Meyer, Senior Scientist at TNO in the Netherlands, and Emmanuelle Shaaravi, Senior Controller and Auditor. I also would like to thank the organization of VDISummit for organizing this webcast and doing the appropriate marketing support. And finally, I would like to invite you to the next VDISummit on AI and cybersecurity, which will be on January 25th. Have a nice day.